أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وبعد. After a long hiatus, we are resuming our continuing series of lectures on the seminal work of René Guénon, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. We left off in chapter 23, and we will be picking up from chapter 24. But I think that at this point in our study of this important work, it is worth our while to remind ourselves of the general outline and thrust of the argument thus far. To that end, I refer the audience to the very first page of the work in the Sophia Perennis edition, Hillsdale, New York. I am using the fourth revised edition from and the second impression thereof from 2004. This is the editorial note. Second paragraph. The reign of quantity gives a concise but comprehensive view of the present state of affairs in the world, as it appears from the point of view of the ancient wisdom, formerly common both to the east and to the west, but now almost entirely lost sight of. This is what the author, Guénon, refers to as tradition, with a capital T. The author indicates with his fabled clarity and directness the precise nature of the modern deviation, and devotes special attention to the development of modern philosophy and science, and to the part played by them with their accompanying notions of progress and evolution in the formation of the industrial and democratic society which we now regard as normal. Guénon sees history, and this is the key point to always keep in mind, as I have emphasized in the past as well. Guénon sees history as a descent from form, capital F, or quality, capital Q, toward matter or quantity. Form is morphe, in Greek also eidos, and matter is hule. This is what we may refer to as the Guénonian understanding of hylomorphism. The editorial note continues, but after the reign of quantity, modern materialism, and the rise of the masses, Guénon predicts a reign of inverted quality just before the end of the age, the triumph of the counter-initiation, the kingdom of Antichrist. And it is this second portion, the reign of inverted quality before the end of the age and the triumph of the counter-initiation, which we shall be dealing with in what remains of this work. So up until now, the argument has focused on the various contours of these of this subversive process or subversive processes, the necrotic tendencies at work in what Guénon calls the Kali Yuga, which we may call the last age, the Iron Age, the age of Kali. These processes have led to what he calls solidification. In chapter 17, chapter 17 was entitled The Solidification of the World. And I would highly recommend the viewers to go back and reread that chapter, and if you like, watch the video devoted to chapter 17. Because at this point, there is a significant shift in Genon's focus in the book away from the theme of solidification, which can be seen as building up to chapter 17, then dominating from chapter 17 up until 23, and now in chapter 24 entitled Toward Dissolution, we have here Genon wishing to focus on the processes or the tendency toward dissolution of the world. So this is how he commences the chapter, which begins on page 165. Having given some attention to the end of the cycle, it is now necessary, as it were, to turn back again, in order to examine more fully the causes that can, under the conditions of the present period, play an effective part in leading humanity and the world toward that end. Two contributing tendencies may be distinguished, and their description involves the use of terms suggesting an apparent antinomy. On one side is the tendency toward what has been called the solidification of the world. Again, that was chapter 17. What is the other member of the polarity or the antinomy? It is dissolution. And he goes on to say, and it is this that has been mainly considered so far. And on the other side is the tendency toward the dissolution of the world. And it remains to examine in detail the action of the latter, for it must not be forgotten that every such end necessarily takes one form and one only, that of the dissolution of the manifested as such. Now, the next several chapters are devoted to this. The dissolution of the manifestation, the dissolution of what seems to be the utterly solid and autonomous material order. Let it be said at once that the second of the two tendencies, namely dissolution, now seems to be beginning to predominate. So Genon wrote this sentence in circa, that is to say, approximately 1945 of the Gregorian calendar. That would be the year. And the reason I'm saying circa or approximately is because the French edition of The Reign of Quantity came out or was published in 1945. So before its publication, who knows at which precise date and time Genon penned this line. But he is convinced, whenever he's writing this, around 1945, that this second of these two tendencies, namely dissolution, now seems to have begun to predominate over the tendency of solidification. He says in this regard, for in the first place, materialism, properly so called, corresponding as it clearly does to solidification in its grossest form, the word petrifaction, in other words, to become solid like stone, could almost be used by analogy with what minerals represent in this connection, has already lost much ground. So, okay, this is very wordy. This is the way Genon writes. He's basically saying that materialism, properly so called, up to his point, has already lost much ground. This was his opinion around 1945. At least in the domain of scientific and philosophical theory. So he's specifically saying that materialism, by 1945, seems to have lost considerable ground in the domain of science and philosophy, if not yet, he says, in that of the common mentality. And this is so far true that, as pointed out earlier, the very notion of matter as it existed in these theories has begun to fade away and to dissolve. I cannot help but think that he was led to this conclusion by the obsession at that time with atomic energy, atomic theory, and of course nuclear weapons, nuclear fission, the atomic bombs which were used in the Second World War. One was dropped on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. At least that's what it seems like. There are actually some theories out there saying that this too never happened. There's so many bizarre things. But we don't want to get off of the topic. So I think that maybe he was led in this direction because of the direction that particle physics was going towards the splitting of the atom and in the ensuing decades, because Genon then died, right? Of this continual splitting of the atom and the further development of particle physics and more exotic particles being discovered or generated and registering on the instrumentation used in particle accelerators. all of this would point to a kind of dissolution, or a dissolving of the very notion of matter, as Guénon says here. In the second place, and correlatively to this change, he continues, the illusion of security that held sway at the time when materialism had attained its greatest influence, and that was then more or less inseparable from the prevailing idea of ordinary life, has in the main been dissipated by the events that have taken place and the speed of their succession, so much so that the dominant impression today is very different, for it has become an impression of instability extending to all domains. Now, these events, he doesn't say what those events are. Did he have in mind the tremendous violence and destruction which was unleashed upon the world in the Second World War? Perhaps. Whatever the case may be, he is very convinced that the phase of solidification is now over and dissolution has begun. Dissolution of the world. He also mentions on page 166 the experience that we have of time, or indeed maybe he literally means the slowing down, the speeding up of time itself. He says the acceleration of time itself, as it becomes ever more pronounced and causes changes to be ever more rapid, seems to lead of its own accord toward dissolution. But it cannot, for that reason, be said that the general direction of events has been modified, for the cyclical movement inevitably continues to follow the same descending course. So no matter what happens, the world has to end. Moreover, the physical theories just referred to. Again, he doesn't specify, but I can't help but think he has in mind, once again, atomic theory. The physical theories just referred to, while they too change with growing rapidity like everything else, continue nonetheless to take on a more and more exclusively quantitative character, to such a point that their character has now become assimilated to that of purely mathematical theories. And this change, as previously indicated, takes them yet further away from the sensible reality that they claim to explain, and leads them into a domain that is necessarily situated on a lower plane than that of sensible reality, as was explained earlier when pure quantity was under consideration. Here again, I think he very much has in mind theoretical physics. In the realm of theoretical physics, and things have really gotten completely out of control, or gone way beyond what they were in the time of Guénon. Theoretical physicists are essentially just mathematicians at this point. And the various physical theories that they present are always in a very sort of abstruse mathematical form, very elaborate mathematical structures, very advanced mathematics, very abstract systems and structures have been put forward that bear little or no resemblance to the actual physical world, or have almost no empirical basis behind them. This is very much the case in modern physics today. In any case, Guénon says, the solid, even at its greatest conceivable density and impenetrability, by no means corresponds to pure quantity. He's said these kind of things before in the previous chapters. Having always at least a minimum of qualitative elements, it is moreover corporeal by definition, and is even in a sense the most corporeal thing possible. Now, corporeality is by definition such that space, however compressed it may be under the conditions appertaining to a solid, is necessarily inherent in its constitution and space. Let it be recalled again, can in no way be assimilated to pure quantity. Even if the point of view of modern science were to be adopted momentarily, so that on the one hand corporeality could be reduced to extension in accordance with Descartes' ideas, and on the other hand space could be regarded as nothing but a mere mode of quantity, the difficulty still remaining would be that everything would be still in the domain of continuous quantity. A change to the domain of discontinuous quantity, that is of number, which alone can be looked upon as representing pure quantity. He means the numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not anything in between, not irrationals, etc. A number which alone can be looked upon as representing pure quantity must then obviously imply, by reason of the said discontinuity alone, that neither the solid nor anything else that is corporeal can subsequently be taken into account. All right, a lot of words there. He's simply saying that even if solidification reaches a maximum, it will never go to the realm of absolute and pure quantity because that's impossible. It will reach a certain maximal point, and then dissolution must begin. And he says this on page 167, paragraph 2. A point is therefore reached in the gradual reduction of everything to the quantitative, at which this reduction no longer leads towards solidification. The maximum point is reached, in other words. And at this point, there arises a desire to assimilate continuous quantity to discontinuous quantity. So this is where the dissolution begins. He likes to use various words to explain his ideas. So he says that you could speak of dissolution, but you could also, from another point of view, speak of volatilization and even of pulverization, a complete crushing or grinding. And I think he's brought in this word pulverization because he wants to say that no matter how much you pulverize something, I mean, if you've ever done something like this, if you've ever ground something to a powder, and then you take it off, there's always some stuff which will be left at the bottom of the mortar and pestle, the thing which you do the pulverization or grinding in, and that is a residue. And he's very interested in the notion of residue, and there's a chapter 26, which is called, no, it's 27, Psychic Residues. And he'll come back to this notion. Yes, so back to the idea of solidification. He also has the notion of crystallization. He says, indeed, the positive results of cyclical manifestation are crystallized in order that they then may be transmuted into the germs of the possibilities of the future cycle through dissolution or through pulverization. Use the term whichever you like. And this constitutes the end point of solidification under its benefic aspect, implying essentially the sublimation that coincides with the final reversal. Whereas whatever cannot be used in this way, that is to say, broadly speaking, whatever constitutes the purely negative results of the particular manifestation is precipitated, another term he uses, in the form of a caput mortuum, in the alchemist sense of the word. He likes to use these alchemical images. So essentially he's saying that solidification will reach a certain maximum point, then dissolution will result, and there will be some kind of a residue, or what he calls inferior prolongations of our state of existence, or into that part of the subtle domain that can properly be qualified as infracorporeal. And this is leading into his next sort of idea. I suppose I should say something about the footnote, since I have imposed upon myself this onerous burden of explaining or trying to explain everything in this book. He has a footnote here, footnote number 1 at the bottom of page 167. And this is in reference to cyclic dissolution. And there is a Latin phrase here, solvet saculum in favilla. The word, it should be saculum, S-A-E-C-U-L-U-M. The U has dropped out. This is taken from the Catholic liturgy, and if you refer to the Catholic Prayer Book and Manual of Meditations, 1883 by Patrick Francis Moran, there is some sort of a liturgical text which in Latin is called Dies Irae, which means the sequence for the dead, I believe, and it reads as follows, and this is what he's alluding to. The day of wrath, that dreadful day, shall the whole world in ashes lay, as David and the Sibyl say. And that explains the reference to David and the Sibyl. Sibyl was a female prophetess or oracle, which is very popular in ancient Greece. So, solvet saculum in favilla, it will turn the world into ashes, in other words, are the exact words of the Catholic liturgy, which incidentally calls upon both the testimony of David and that of the Sibyl in this matter. And this in itself is one of the ways in which the unanimous agreement of the different traditions is confirmed. If you like, I don't really know how important this reference is or how relevant, but this is the way that Guénon wrote. Obviously, he's elaborating upon this theme of dissolution, pulverization, volatilization, and so forth. And when he was writing these words of the Catholic liturgy, which he must have learned at some point in his earlier life, came to his mind. So yes, he's very interested in this kind of alchemical terminology. And there's another author. He's not a traditional author, like Genon with a capital T, but who also has resorted to a kind of alchemical analogy in understanding things. He speaks of the alchemical processing of humanity, this sort of brainwashing or social engineering, call it what you will, that is taking place all around us. And it involves a kind of, if you look at the material as being the human material, as a kind of transformation and transmutation that takes place, but in a negative sense, not toward the better and that which is above, but to that which is below, and therefore making such people completely beholden to the processes of destruction in the Kali Yuga. And so that's what he elaborates on further in the chapter at the top of the page on page 168. In the next paragraph, he says, at this point, the following question must be put. In order that dissolution may be fully realized, it is sufficient that the movement by which the reign of quantity asserts itself with ever-growing intensity should be more or less left to itself and be allowed to pursue its own course right up to its final goal. So what is that goal? These processes, the process of dissolution, and he will pick this up later, leads to complete and total deviation, and that deviation leads to subversion. Deviation and subversion is the title of chapter 29. And this will result in an inversion of symbols, which is chapter 30. And then you will have a kind of anti-tradition, a counter-tradition which will come, and this will be confused by replaced by a complete counter-tradition, a counterfeit spirituality which will inaugurate the reign of the Dajjal or the Antichrist. So at this point, the following question may be put. In order that dissolution may be fully realized, is it sufficient that the movement by which the reign of quantity asserts itself with ever-growing intensity should be more or less left to itself and be allowed to pursue its own course right up to its final goal? That's the question. The answer. The truth is that such a possibility, which has indeed already been suggested in what has been said about the contemporary conceptions of the physicists and the implications they carry, as it were unconsciously, for it is obvious that modern scientists have no idea where they are going, belongs rather to a theoretical outlook on the situation, a unilateral outlook affording only a very partial view of what must really happen. Okay, so he obviously has in mind much more than the dissolution of the world that we find among the physicists, and again, I think he has in mind atomic theory. There is more to it, and he introduces a very interesting notion, and that is the notion of knots. K-N-O-T-S, like tying a knot. And he says, actually, in order to undo the knots, he puts that in quotes, resulting from the solidification that has been going on up until now, and the word knots is used intentionally as it suggests the effects of a certain kind of coagulation, particularly connected with the realm of magic, the intervention of something more directly effective for the purpose in view is required. And this something must no longer belong to the domain, the very restricted domain to which the reign of quantity itself properly belongs. Very interesting that he uses the word knots, because he has in mind influences of an inferior order. He continues at the very bottom of the page, going over to page 169, from 168 to 169. It is easy to perceive from the occasional indications already given that the action of influences of the subtle order is involved. Such action really began long ago to operate in the modern world, although at first it did so in no very apparent manner, and it has actually always coexisted with materialism from the very moment at which the latter was first constituted in a clearly defined form, as was indicated earlier when dealing with magnetism and spiritualism, and the borrowings they have made from the scientific mythology of the period in which they came to birth, as has also been pointed out before. Though it be true that the hold of materialism is slackening, there is no occasion to rejoice at the fact, for cyclical manifestation is not yet complete, and the fissures then alluded to, the nature of which will shortly receive further consideration, can only be produced from below. Influences of an inferior order, as I said. In other words, that which interferes with the sensible world through those fissures can be nothing but an inferior cosmic psychism in its most destructive and disorganizing forms, and it is moreover clear that influences of this kind are the only ones that are really suited for action having dissolution as its objective. Very interesting. Very, very interesting indeed. So going back to page 168, where he brings in the notion of knots as a reference to a certain kind of coagulation, particularly connected with the realm of magic. من شر النفاثات في العقد. In Surah Al-Falaq of the Quran, we seek refuge with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from those who blow upon knots. من شر, from the evil of those. من شر النفاثات في العقد. And from the evil of those, and that's feminine, who blow upon knots. So there was a form of magical coagulation, or knotting, or binding, what is called in Urdu bandish, and hence bandish lagana, to bind or put some sort of a hindrance on someone or something, is something we find in magic, in a sihr. And in the modern world, a lot of this is done in a very, very hidden way, or something which is really hidden in the opening. A lot of this kind of manipulation of modern people is done through advertising, through public relations, through now very much through social media. People are completely bound in a particular social media bubble, especially if they're really plugged into all of these ridiculous applications and so forth and have become mesmerized by them. There are some people who do use these things, and but they're not really, they haven't really taken over their lives. But the vast majority of people live in the TikTok, Instagram, X sort of world, and any number of other things like, I don't know what is out there, Twitch, and I can't keep track of all of this. This is the world that they occupy. And there's also a manipulation through the algorithm, through the various search algorithms and so forth, and a certain fake reality is created, and that is what they are mired in. A lot of this is also there in the realm of music, but this notion of binding is a very old one in the West, and there's a very important book in this regard. You won't really find this anywhere else. It's in a book called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance by Ion P. Culianu. I talked about this in my recent video on Mircea Eliade and the Eliade reading list, and he was a colleague of his, he was a student of his. So this is really a study of Giordano Bruno, as well as Marsilio Ficino, as well as Pico della Mirandola. And it looks into a particular treatise by Giordano Bruno called On Binding. And in other words, how you use the power of Eros, which is very much there in the modern world, to control people. There's also the realm of music, and much of that is dealt with in another very important study by D.P. Walker entitled Spiritual and Demonic Magic from Ficino to Campanella. This is a very interesting book because it was published, I think originally by the Warburg Institute. And the Warburg Institute is a very interesting place. It was founded by someone named Abi Warburg, or Abi Warburg. And they're a very, very, very wealthy banking family, related by marriage, if I'm not mistaken, to the Rothschilds as well. And Abi Warburg was interested in the study of the Renaissance, and I've been to the Warburg Institute. I've been to their library. It's a very interesting library. It's the only library I've ever been to. It has a very interesting sort of system of classification of the books, according to a scheme invented by Abi Warburg himself. And there's a lot of interest there in magic, and it's the only library I've ever been to that has a section devoted to the Antichrist, a section devoted to omens such as comets and other astrological phenomenon. Very interesting if you look into all of this. And Genon says that this action, these sort of influences, such action really began long ago to operate in the modern world. Page 169. And it has always coexisted from the very moment that materialism was constituted. So there are many things which Genon just sort of alludes to, and you have to investigate and look into these things yourself. This is what we might call the hidden history, or even the secret history of the Kali Yuga. In this regard, I think that some of the very infernal energies were unleashed onto the world through certain satanic individuals who have existed in history. And I do not have the time to go into all of these things. So again, Genon also just points. And I'm not saying that this is exactly what he had in mind, but you have to do your own research and look into these hidden dimensions of the history of the Kali Yuga. But one of these satanic individuals was Sabbatai Zevi, and there is a massive book on this subject by Gershom Scholem. Sabbatai Zevi, that's all I'm going to say. Go and look into this individual. In Gershom Scholem's work, The Messianic Idea in Judaism, he has a very interesting chapter. The chapters are not numbered. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3. So 4, 5, and 6. Chapter 4, Redemption Through Sin. The next chapter, the crypto-Jewish sect of the Dönme, Sabbateans in Turkey. The next chapter, a Sabbatean will from New York. Please refer to this book. There's also the phenomenon of another satanic individual in the line of Sabbatai Zevi. His name is Jacob Frank. There is a book here called The Heresy of Jacob Frank, appropriately written by some chap by the name of J. Michelson, a known homosexual. Another important work, Gershom Scholem, From Frankism to Jacobinism. The Life of Moses Dobruschka, alias Franz Thomas von Schoenfeld, alias Junius Frey. A very strange and yet important book that sheds light on one of the darkest chapters in the hidden history of the Kali Yuga. These are all forces of dissolution and necrosis. He also has in mind, as you go further on page 169, he speaks of the fissures in the wall, or the fissures in the Great Wall, and that's another chapter. That's, in fact, chapter 25. He has in mind here jinn, demons, satans, devils, etc. In other words, all of the extremely dark sublunar forces. There is a profound interest nowadays in magic, the occult, the Lurianic Kabbalah, which he alludes to in footnote number 2 on page 168. Again, these are very detailed things. You will have to look into those yourself. But generally speaking, there is what he calls this inferior cosmic psychism, and he says that it's in its most destructive and disorganizing forms. He went on to in that paragraph, in the last sentence of that big paragraph, he says, "It is not difficult to see that thenceforth everything that tends to favor and to extend these interferences, merely corresponds, whether consciously or otherwise, to a fresh phase of the deviation, of which materialism in reality represented a less advanced stage, even though the outward appearances of things may not seem to support this view, appearances often being highly deceptive. Then he talks about, in the next paragraph, extending over to the next page, page 170, about certain so-called traditionalists who were very happy about this dissolution in the sense that it is ending this period of solidification, and there seems to be an interest in some sorts of spirituality. But again, these are deviated forms of spirituality. You have a tremendous fascination, and we will, I think, have more to say about this in the next chapter on fissures in the Great Wall. But there is a tremendous fascination with spirits and the occult and things like this. There's even been a strange renaissance, so to speak, a reemergence, an attempt to reconstruct ancient magical systems, such as the Greek mathematical papyri, and delving into so-called Solomonic magic. And there's some extremely erudite people who have been involved in this, but they're also involved in the practice of these things. The name that comes to mind is that of Stephen Skinner. If you are interested in finding out more about this, you should refer to the many interviews which he gave to something called the Glitch Bottle podcast. And he had a massive Ph.D. dissertation on this topic, which was published as 2 separate books. One had the title of Solomonic Magic, and I think the other one had something to do, had Greek magical papyri or something to that effect in the title. You can search that online. But these are all completely diabolical tendencies. This is what he says on page 170, that these traditionalists with a small t, who are quite ecstatic at this emerging new so-called spirituality, he says, what they do not see, and then there's a big parenthetical, let's just skip that, what they do not see is that they are really faced with a fresh stage in the development, perfectly logical, but of a logic truly diabolical, of the plan, in quotations, according to which the progressive deviation of the modern world is brought about. And I would submit to you that this is a very old plan. And again, historically, I think that I am rather confident in identifying this major turn with the emergence of Sabbateanism and everything that it unleashed onto the modern, unleashed into history, so to speak. In this plan, Genon continues, materialism has of course played its part, and undeniably a highly important part. But the mere negation that it represents has now become inadequate. It has given efficient service in denying to man access to possibilities of a superior order. But it has not the power to unchain the inferior forces that alone can bring to finality the work of disorder and dissolution. So when people, on the one hand, materialism and complete materialism going towards solidification has cut people off from influences of a higher order. And then in the process of dissolution, the influences of the inferior order, the infracorporeal and inferior sort of entities and energies have been unleashed. And people have no means in the modern world, if they are moderns, to defend themselves from these destructive, subtle influences. Regarding these, Genon says, bottom of page 170 over to 171, ending the chapter, the destructive, subtle influences will at once make their way in, and they will do so all the more easily, because thanks to the negative work accomplished in the preceding phase, no element of a superior order will be able to intervene in such a way as to counteract them. It's a very dangerous situation. If you do not have access to spiritual means, if all you know about spirituality is maybe you do some yoga, and this is the trend we have. We have some people who do yoga, and they have some sort of a guru, and they have some crystals, and they like to drink green tea, matcha lattes, and run around and do this sort of stuff. They have no idea what they are involved in, and they have no idea on how to deal with these sort of influences. Yet there is a fascination with that realm. People in the modern world are desperately looking, I think, many of them, for some sort of confirmation that there's more than just materialism. That is why there is a fascination with this kind of things. That is why there is a fascination with the horror genre in film and television and streaming. TV is over. And there are a lot of these sort of horror movies and so forth that are there. Because they answer, on the one hand, to that fascination. And they cater to it. On the other hand, they further process. They're further part and parcel of this process of unleashing of evil, subtle energies into the world. They are vectors of this dissolution. And this finally results with a kind of what Genon calls inferior psychism, a pseudo-realization. You have all sorts of crackpots and frauds and fakes walking around who claim to be spiritual masters and so forth, and they're actually quite the contrary. They are not awliya-ullah. They are not awliya ur-Rahman. They are not the saints of the All-Merciful. They are awliya ul-Shaytan, the saints, so to speak, a complete inversion of Satan himself. So this delusion of inverted spirituality is what Genon ends with, and he then uses this to go and elaborate further upon the unleash of these energies in the next chapter, which is called The Fissures in the Great Wall. Then he returns in the next chapter, which is chapter 26, to discuss inverted spirituality and mistaken notions in the chapter called Shamanism and Sorcery. So we will conclude our discussion of Toward Dissolution, and indeed this theme continues over into the next chapter, and I invite you to click on the next video on the next lecture, and we will see you there. Thank you.